Hi guys, it's Riot from Night Riot Cosplays. Today we are finishing up Klee's costume by making her bag, and I'm finally going to show you guys how I prepped and painted all of the 3D printed pieces for this costume. You're going to find that in this video I reference a lot of other videos, and that I don't have proper footage for multiple things. This is mostly because I had to remake the entire bag, which I'll explain a little bit later. But I hope that with all of the links and resources that I'm giving you guys are able to kind of imagine how I made the entire bag, despite not having all of the footage of how I made it. That being said, I hope you guys enjoy this last part, and that you guys are finally able to make your complete Blossoming Starlight Klee costume as well. Let's get crafting. Finally, we have made it to the final video of Klee's entire Blossoming Starlight costume. So this video starts with us making her bag. Here I am showing you kind of the measurements that I had originally. This actually changes in the end. With these measurements, the bag actually ended up being too small. So I ended up having to resize them, and I'll show you guys the final sizes here when I start explaining that. Most of the steps that I'm going to show you guys here were the same when I was making both bags. Just know that the footage that you're seeing is not the final bag. I actually ended up making a whole nother bag because I was not satisfied with the first one. So first things first, we start with our fabrics. I got 2 pleather fabrics from Hobby Lobby. These are the fabrics that you get on those really big rolls beside the original fabrics. So this is a kind of light tan color that I'm using for the base, and then I'm using this nice bright red pleather for the red parts. I really liked using faux leather here. One, because it's giving the texture of it actually being a right bag, and it's non-fraying, so it's a lot easier to sew on details when I don't have to worry about it fraying. So first things first, I start by cutting out a rectangle of the final size that I want the bag to be. The final bag size ended up being 36.5 inches by 20 inches, so that's the square that I am cutting out of the light tan fabric first. Then I go to my red fabric and I cut out a rectangle that is 12 inches tall by 36.5 inches wide. This is because I wanted the red part of the bag, including the scallops, to be about 12 inches high on the bag. So here you can see what I mean by that. My scallops ended up being 1.5 inches tall, so I made sure to account for that when I decided how tall I wanted the red part to be. But you guys can go shorter on your scallops or taller. It really just depends on how much red you want on your bag. Here you can see how I start making my scallop pattern. I start by taking a piece of paper that is about 4 inches wide. This is because I want my scallops to be 4 inches in width. So then all I do is fold over the paper to find the center, and I make a mark about 1.5 inches up from that. And then I take something round and I connect the edge of the paper to my mark. And when you cut it out, what you should have is that scalloped shape that is 4 inches wide and 1.5 inches tall. I do this so that I have a pattern for my scallops and I don't have to be measuring all of these out on my fabric. With that done, I take my red pleather fabric and I fold it in half. Then I make a mark where the halfway point is, and that is where I put my first scallop. I trace out that center scallop, and then I make a straight line all the way across the width of the pleather to make sure that when I line up my scallops, they're all sitting evenly, like straight on the bottom part. Then once I have my line marked to make sure that all of my scallops are the same height all the way throughout, I just go through and trace out the scallop pattern, making sure that I am putting the edges of the pattern right next to each other so there are no weird gaps in between each of my scallops. Once I have my scallops traced, I just go through and carefully cut them out. Again, I'm using a pleather fabric here so I don't have to worry about fraying, but now we need to connect the red pieces to the white piece. So I go through and I line up the bottoms of my fabric so that the red fabric sits on top, and then I just pin it around the edges about where the seam allowances are. This is just to make sure that nothing shifts while I'm sewing it. And I'm doing this about where the seam allowances are because when you pin fabric, you leave holes. And I did not trust clips to hold this in place while I was moving it around in my sewing machine. So I just made sure that my pins were sitting in the seam allowances. Then I take this to my sewing machine and very slowly and carefully I go through and sew along the top of each of the scallops about 1/8 of an inch away to make sure that the red stitches get covered with the brown stitches that we put on later. Now we move on to the hardest part of this entire bag, which is the brown embroidery detail that Klee has on her bag. Specifically where the scallops meet the tan colored fabric. You can tell on the reference photos that there's a little bit of just a brown edging there. So I decided to tackle this detail by embroidering it. Originally on the first bag I embroidered all of the brown details onto it by hand. However, I was running out of time to make this second bag, and hand embroidering was not going to be an option. So instead I turned to machine embroidery, or what's called darning. So darning is a process of taking a bunch of threads and overlapping them a bunch of times on a patch of fabric that has like torn in order to mend the hole. Traditionally this is done by hand, but a lot of modern sewing machines have an option to actually darn as well, which I was lucky to find out that my sewing machine did. I am not the best at darning, and I don't pretend to be an expert on how to darn, so here's a really good video that I watched on how it works. But essentially when you are machine embroidering or darning, there is nothing holding the fabric in place. It is just you and the needle. You are moving the fabric under the needle. There is nothing else moving your fabric, which is kind of the tricky part. So to get my machine prepared for darning, my machine came with what's called a darning plate, which is just some little white plate that I hook onto my sewing machine that covers the feed dogs. Like I said, there is nothing moving the fabric when you are darning or embroidering on a sewing machine, so you need to cover your feed dogs, or in some sewing machines you just there's a setting or a screw that you can use to lower the feed dogs. Once the feed dogs are out of the way, I have to take my entire presser foot mechanism out of the way because you can't be lifting and lowering a presser foot onto your fabric or it won't be able to move freely. But with my sewing machine prepared, I did a couple test pieces. Definitely when you are first getting into this machine embroidery, I recommend trying it on a bunch of different fabrics before you even try to embroider the leather. But like I said, I was running out of time, so it was now or never for me. So the footage that you're seeing right now is real time. This is actually how slowly I went through this entire machine embroidering process. It just takes a lot of patience, a lot of going slowly, and a lot of error. There are multiple times in this process where I end up having to rethread my entire sewing machine because my threads got caught and tangled in each other and my sewing machine just stopped on me. So do I recommend machine embroidering or darning? I think it's a really cool thing to learn how to do, and it can come in handy in a pinch, but you know, definitely take the time to learn how to properly do it because it's not easy, and I was afraid multiple times that the sewing machine would just go right through my finger. So do what you will with that information, but for me, what I did to get this brown detailing on there, I darned the entire edge. My footage is a little bit out of place here, but it doesn't matter which order you do these two steps in, whether you darn your bag first or you add these little appliques, it doesn't matter. But here you can just see me adding the kind of clover appliques that Klee has. I take some craft felt in a darker brown that kind of matches the thread color, and I cut out the little triangle, almost flowery pieces that Klee has here. And then I just take some super glue and very lightly, you do not want to put a lot of super glue on the back of felt, or it will show up a lot on the opposite side. It'll show up as like a little white patch on it. If it's just a little bit of that white patch, you can just take something wet and rub it right off and you won't be able to see it. But if you put too much super glue on the back, you will not be able to get rid of that. So be very, very frivolous with your super glue. The reason we're super gluing this is just so that we can keep them in place when we sew them on. You can definitely pin these down instead, but I did not want to risk the pinholes, and they were in such weird places and hard places to get to on the sewing machine that I just opted to glue them down in a quick and easy way. So I started by super gluing them down, and then I take the large piece to my sewing machine again, and I just go through and I top stitch around the edge of all of these flower applique pieces. Then with all the detail pieces of Klee's bag, we can move on to... Then once those two pieces of Klee's bag are done, we can move on to the piping details. So in the original videos that I had recorded, I only put piping along the top edge, but in the end footage you will see that there's actually piping on the two sides as well. So keep that in mind. It was a design choice by me the second time around. I decided that adding the brown piping edge to the sides gave it a really nice effect and looked really nice, but you definitely don't have to. It does add a lot of work. But I did teach you guys a little bit on how to make piping a couple videos back, so the process is essentially the same. For this top layer of fabric, I am cutting a piece of that white rope or cording that I had used beforehand on the skirt. So it's 1/2 inch cording, and then we're cutting it out of a brown, like upholstery faux leather. I measure the top of the bag, and then I take away 3/4 of an inch for both sides. So it ends up being 1.5 inches. So the original bag size was 36.5. I ended up cutting out my rope to be 35 inches long, and then I cut out a piece of that brown upholstery leather, also 35 inches wide, and then it's 1/2 inch cording, so we double that because we need to fold it over. That's 1 inch, and then we add an inch for seam allowance. That makes 2 inches. So I'm cutting out a piece of leather that is 2 inches wide by 35 inches long, making sure that I'm not counting the end bits of this upholstery leather that are just batting. Once again, I just take the cording and I encase it inside of my leather fabric, and I sew a stitch all the way down. Then I just take my piping and I place it on the top, I pin it down, and I sew all the way down on top of the line of stitches that I had done originally. This is called doing a stitch in the ditch, because you don't want the stitch to show up on the other side. At this point is also when I sewed the piping to the two sides of the bag. So I had to cut the whole piece in half. So all I do is I fold it over, I mark about half all the way down, and then I cut this entire project in half. It was very daunting, but I did it for the sake of it looking good. And then I take one of those pieces of fabric, like the bag fabric, so I take one of the two pieces that I just cut, and I put piping on both sides using the same technique, just making sure that I am accounting for the 20 inches instead. And I used a 1/4 inch piping instead of 1/2 inch piping, but the process is otherwise the same. And then with those two edges done, I was able to move on. At this point is where I realized that Klee needs a place for her little lantern to hang from, so I take a scrap piece of the tan leather and I just cut out a small rectangle from it, and I sew a snap to one end of it, and then I fold it over just a little bit, making sure that I have some extra fabric on the end, and I sew the other side of the snap. And then I mark on my big piece of bag pattern where I want the little dangly part to go, and I just sew it all on by hand, making sure I do a square and then an X to make sure that it's held on tightly. I definitely recommend doing this before you sew up the side seams of your bag, just because it's a lot easier than trying to sew it on while it's in one circle already. Then at this point I sew up the side seams. However, because I had 2 layers of brown faux leather and then 2 layers of the colored faux leather at this point, I was unable to run all of this fabric under my sewing machine. So the side seams had to be sewn up by hand using real leather working techniques. Unfortunately, I do not have footage of me sewing up these side seams. But I did watch this video on how to do it. I used the single needle technique because that's all I had. So I went out and I bought a much thicker thread and a leather working needle so that I could stitch up the side seams myself. While I was doing this, I was also trying to make it easier on myself. So I snipped the tan fabric. The tan fabric in the back, I ended up cutting off the bottommost part that was unnecessary at that point because I wanted to give myself the best chance of sewing this together nicely, not having gaps, and also not ruining my fingers. So just keep that in mind. If you have like an industrial sewing machine, maybe you could sew through all of this, but my little home sewing machine could not do it. So fair warning, I ended up having to sew all of this by hand. Once the side seams were sewn together, I moved on to doing the bottom seam. At this point, the only footage that I have of me sewing up the bottom seam is from the old bag on my sewing machine, but the process is the same. Just keep in mind that I hand sewed this in the end. Here is a video that I watched on how to do this process because I wanted Klee's bag to be very square on the bottom so it could stand on its own instead of being really round at the bottom. So all I did was I folded my fabric in half one way, and then I measured the halfway point from there, and I drew a line about a ½ inch from the bottom. Then I take this to my sewing machine and I sewed up the ½ inch line that I had marked. On the bigger bag that I made, this actually turned out to be a whole inch. But on this mini bag that I'm making, or the smaller bag that was my first try, I only went up ½ inch. Then I fold the sides together so that it's in the center. Essentially what you're trying to do is make the side seams match up to that smaller seam that you just made, so that you get kind of square edges. And then you just sew a ½ inch from the edge along those pieces. Again, in the final project, this ended up being like 4 or 5 layers of fabric that I had to go through. So I did hand stitch it down, but the process is all the same again. And when you do that, when you turn it inside out, you should get a nice boxy bottom, and the bag is able to now stand on its own without any support on the inside. Once the bottom of the bag is sewn together, I can sew on the straps so that I'm able to take it on and off. I don't have proper footage of this either, but essentially all I did was I take a D-ring and on the rounded edge of the D-ring, I sew my strap onto it. The strap is just that faux leather from before. I cut out long strips of it, and then I turned it inside out and top stitched it. So I take the strap and I fold it over, and then I sew it together. And then on the opposite side of the D-ring, I take a scrap piece of that tan pleather and I sew it onto the other end, and then I sew the pleather onto the bag. Here's a little diagram about where I put the ends of the straps. But once the straps are sewed on, I can put my buckle on it, my 3D printed buckle. So all I do is I poke a hole with an awl to put the kind of bar part through, and then I take the buckle part of it and I just slide it on, making sure that on the correct side it's sitting underneath the bar, and then on the wrong side of where the bar goes, I place it with some hot glue, and then on the wrong side I just fold it back and I hot glue it down as well. Then once the glue has dried down, I take a large snap and I sew one end to the strap that has the buckle part, and the other end I measure about how high up I want it to connect, and I sew it there as well. And then I just snap the two straps together and I pull the slider over top the two straps, making sure that I have a really tight fit on these because it will hold it together. So essentially this buckle is functional. I can take it on and off, but for the entire con day that I was wearing this, I would just slip the strap over my head if I wanted to take the bag off. Here you can finally see the final bag in all of its beautiful glory. So before I scrunch it up, I take some polyfill and I stuff it into the bottommost part of the bag, just so that I'm giving it a little bit of structure to hold on to, so that the middle part stays as full as it can while only the top part of the bag is staying scrunched, so it almost looks full. I know you saw me put the lining in there. I take it out later, so don't even worry about it. Once I have it as stuffed as I want it to be, I go on and hot glue on my doily that I had crocheted earlier. I have absolutely no footage of me making this doily. It was my first time ever crocheting one of these. I've been crocheting for years, but trying to read these patterns is kind of hard. Here's the pattern that I followed for my doily, and the link to the pattern can be found down below. All I did was I made the full one and then I just folded it in half, or a little bit shorter than half, so that the topmost spikes had a little bit of dimension. And then I starched it. There's some great tutorials on starching, but essentially all you do is you pin it on some mats until it's in the right shape that you want it, and then you just spray it with starch like this. Once it's dry, it should keep its shape. Then we need some strong cord in order to tie the top part of the bag. So I just take some clear paracord that I had lying around, like the type you use for friendship bracelets, and I tie it around the bag. Definitely experiment with where you want the tie to be on the bag. I kind of went higher on this one, just because I wanted the scrunch to really be focused on the top and not so much on the bottom. But again, experiment with where you want your tie to be. And then I just tie it around the bag, making sure that I'm making a really sturdy knot in the back. Then I take the bow and the 3D printed piece that I had put together earlier. If you guys want to see how I made this bow and the 3D printed parts, go a little bit forward in the video. I'm showing how I did that at the end. But essentially here, to connect it, all I did was I ran a string through the back of the bow, like the scrunched up part. I just take a string and I poke it through that scrunched up part, and once it's through and it's connected to both sides, I take the embroidery thread and I tie it around the same area that I tied the paracord around, and then I just make sure to knot it nicely in the back, and then I take some hot glue to really make sure that the bow is stuck and secure onto the bag. And that makes the bag for Blossoming Starlight Klee done. Finally, for the moment that you've all been waiting for, the part where I show you how I 3D printed everything. So I decided to make this at the end just because I wanted to give a little bit more in-depth details about my 3D printing process. So I am a beginner when it comes to 3D printing and 3D modeling things. I use Blender as my 3D modeling software, and all of the pieces except for the vision I 3D modeled myself. If you are looking to just get the files for Klee's entire costume, you can find them on my Patreon. I have them linked there. The link to my Patreon is down below, so they are available there for you guys to use. Like I said, I am still a beginner when it comes to 3D modeling, so the files aren't perfect, but I did try my best. Once I had everything 3D modeled, I send them to my 3D printer. I just have the very standard basic Creality Ender 3, the most basic model. Once everything was printed, I start going through the horrendous sanding process. For the most part, I try to make sure that my prints are as smooth around the corners as I can get them in my modeling software. But obviously with 3D prints, you're going to have a lot of harsh lines left over. If you have some really bad harsh lines, like here, what I do is I take a little bit of acetone or nail polish remover and I dip some sandpaper, some very high grit sandpaper, like a fine grit sandpaper, into the acetone, and then I sand down those really harsh lines. I find that this takes away the absolute worst of the lines, but for a lot of the smaller layer lines, I do just go in with a pretty rough sandpaper going first. I think I use 120 grit, and then I make a big jump up to 320 grit sandpaper, mostly because I absolutely hate sanding all of this, so I try to make these big jumps quickly. I do sand all of this by hand just because they're tiny pieces and there's a lot of little crevices that I need to get into. But a lot of people like to use an electric sander to make this process go faster. It really is all up to your personal preference. Once everything has been sanded down, I take a wet paper towel and I wipe down all of my 3D prints just to make sure that I get all of the dust off of my 3D print pieces. And then I take it to my paint station and I spray it with primer filler, automotive primer filler. You can find this in the automotive section of a lot of hardware stores. I just use the Rust-Oleum kind. I spray a really nice, even, thick coat across all of my pieces, trying my best to not make any thick puddles, just because this is if you have to sand down the big puddles and drips of the filler primer, it's going to get a lot more sandy. But once I've sprayed everything down and I let it dry, I go in again with my sandpaper. This time I'm going in with the finest sandpaper I can find. It's like a finishing sandpaper. It doesn't say grit on it, but it just says for smooth finishing. And I just run that all over. And then I carefully inspect all of my pieces. On a lot of the smaller pieces for Klee, I found that I could just do one layer of filler primer and sanding and I was good. A couple pieces I did need to go in though and spray again with the second coat of filler primer and then sand it down again, and then they were good. Once all of the 3D printed pieces are as smooth as I can get them, I can go in and start painting. So first things first, with this footage, I was really trying to show you guys this kind of watercolor effect that I was trying to achieve on Klee's lantern. My original idea was to try and make the lantern actually glow with LEDs in it, but I was unable to make that work, so I ended up having to improvise a bit, and I am instead doing a kind of watercolor technique on the lantern to try get the same effect. To do this, all I did was primed the part that's supposed to light up of the lantern with a white gesso, and then I take acrylic paints. You can use watercolor paints here too, but I personally like using acrylics. I get my brush really wet and make sure that there's still water dripping from it, and then I carefully pick up a little bit of paint on my paintbrush and I just start dabbing it onto the primed part of the lantern. And then I just kind of let the water move everything. I make sure that I move the lantern around, I turn it upside down so that the big water droplets move. But essentially I'm just letting the water do the watercolor effect on its own and try not to control it too much. That's when you get the best results, when you're not trying to control it as much. As for the rest of the 3D prints, they all got painted with gold acrylic color or green acrylic color and gesso. Here you can also see that I resin casted my vision. It did not end up working for me. It was just too dull and I couldn't get the gold to sit in the right places. So I ended up using the 3D printed version that I had made originally, and I just painted that as well with acrylic colors. All of the pieces should be included in the link down below. All of the models should be included. Again, if you want to check them out. Once everything was painted and they were nice and solid costume, including the little buckles and the silver on the lantern, I just take a silver paint, spray paint from Rust-Oleum, and I spray it all over. And then once everything has been painted, I just go in with a satin spray varnish, just so that there's not a lot of shine on these pieces, especially because the silver spray paint is really reflective and I didn't quite like how it looked. So I just go in with a satin spray varnish, and that makes Blossoming Starlight Klee's costume done. Finally, Blossoming Starlight Klee is done and finally ready to be worn. This entire project was a very big journey for me. It was one of the very first projects that I really took my time on to put together and make sure that I'm looking at all the details. Obviously, I've made a lot of my own costumes already, but this costume in particular, I'm going to hold it very near and dear to my heart just because of how much time and effort I actually put into making sure that all of the details were perfect. I have already got my next couple videos planned out and how I want to make it. Basically the rest of the year for the most part is planned out when it comes to content for you guys. I just want to say thank you for following me through the entire process, and I hope that you guys are able now to make your own Blossoming Starlight Klee costumes, and I hope they come out just as beautiful and as detailed as mine was. So yeah, once again, if you want to find any resources, files, or links, they are all down below. I made sure to give credit where credit was due in this entire process. I'll see you for the next project. Bye!